The air snapped with a sharp, metallic tang of ozone as a shower of blue sparks danced across my workbench. To anyone else, I was just a man playing with garbage in a dark alley, but they did not see the masterpiece hiding under the rust. I gripped the heavy, pitted wrench until my knuckles turned white, knowing this one turn would rewrite the laws of science. They thought I was finished. Subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because the person sleeping in a shelter was about to change everything. I remember the way the air conditioning used to hum in my office on the 50th floor. It was a smooth, expensive sound, the kind of noise that tells you that you have really made it in life. Now, the only sound I hear is the constant drip of a leaky pipe and the distant heavy rumble of the subway trains running underneath the sidewalk. My name is Arthur, and not too long ago, I was the man everyone wanted to shake hands with. I wore suits that cost more than the car I drive now, and I had a permanent seat at the table where the future of flight was decided. But that was before Victor Thorne decided he wanted my chair more than he wanted our friendship. Victor was a young man with a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. I took him under my wing because I saw a spark in him that reminded me of myself when I was starting out. I thought it was a spark of genius, but it turned out to be a spark of pure, cold greed. I taught him everything I knew about aeronautical engineering. I shared my secret notes, my rough sketches, and my lifelong dreams of the Skyglider engine. I treated him like the son I never had, inviting him to my home for Sunday dinners and celebrating every small victory together. And how did he thank me? He waited until the project was almost finished, and then he planted a trail of digital evidence that made it look like I was selling our blueprints to a foreign competitor. I still remember the day the security guards came for me. It was a Tuesday, a bright and sunny morning that felt like it should have been full of promise. Victor did not even have the courage to look me in the eye when they walked into my office. He stood behind the CEO, looking down at his polished leather shoes while I was stripped of my access badge and my dignity. The board of directors, people I had known for 20 years and considered friends, looked at me like I was a common criminal. Within a single week, my bank accounts were frozen, my house was foreclosed on, and my name was dragged through the mud in every newspaper in the country. I went from the very top of the world to the very bottom in the blink of an eye. But here is the thing about being an engineer. You do not just stop thinking because you lose your fancy office. You do not stop building just because you do not have a laboratory filled with million-dollar equipment. For the last 2 years, I have been living in the shadows of the city. To the people walking by on their way to work, I am just another nameless homeless man huddled in a doorway or sleeping on a park bench. They see my frayed coat and my dirty fingernails, and they quickly look away, afraid that my bad luck might be catching. They do not see the man who can calculate the lift capacity of a wing in his head while he waits for a soup kitchen to open. They do not see the genius who is building something revolutionary out of the things they throw in the trash. My new lab is a small, quiet corner of a basement in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It is damp, it is freezing cold in the winter, and it smells like old wet paper and dust. But it is mine. I have spent months scouring the city, collecting pieces of discarded copper, mesh from old screen doors, and plastic soda bottles from the recycling bins. I have been building the Lazarus filter. It looks like a pile of junk to the untrained eye, a messy collection of tubes and scrap metal. But it is a marvel of engineering. It can take the most polluted, sludge-filled water from the city drains and turn it into something clearer and purer than what comes out of a luxury hotel tap. I watched my friends in the homeless camp get sick from drinking bad water, and it broke my heart into a million pieces. That was the moment I realized that my talent was not just for making rich people fly faster across the ocean. It was for keeping people alive right here on the ground. I started small, giving the filters to the families living under the bridge. I did not ask for a single penny. I did not want fame or a pat on the back. I just wanted to see a mother give her child a glass of water without having to worry if it would make him sick by morning. Seeing the light of gratitude in their eyes was a better reward than any bonus check I ever received during my years at Thorn Aerospace. Tonight, though, something feels very different. I am standing across the street from the Sterling Hotel, watching the long line of black cars pull up to the curb. The men are in crisp tuxedos, and the women are draped in expensive silk and sparkling diamonds. They are here for the Thorn Aerospace annual gala. It is a massive celebration of the Sky Glider engine, the very thing I spent 10 years of my life creating. Victor is the guest of honor tonight. He is going to stand on that stage and take credit for my work, while the people in this city struggle to find a clean drink of water. I look down at my hands. They are calloused and stained with grease that never quite comes off, but they are steady as a rock. I have a small device tucked into the deep pocket of my coat. It is a prototype, a compact version of my Lazarus technology, but it has another use that Victor would never expect. I know the plumbing and the electrical systems of this hotel better than anyone else alive, because I was the lead consultant on the original design years ago. I know where the weaknesses are. I know that Victor, in his rush to save money and look like a corporate hero, has cut corners on the maintenance of the building. As I walk toward the service entrance, a young security guard puts a hand on my chest. He tells me to move along and says, "There is no place for people like me at an event like this." I do not get angry. I just smile at him. It is a warm, knowing smile that seems to confuse him. I tell him that I am just looking for a bit of warmth on a cold night. But inside, my mind is already calculating the flow of the water through the basement pipes. I can feel the vibration of the building through the soles of my boots. It is a nervous, shaky hum. The hotel is under stress, just like the people Victor has stepped on to get to the top of the ladder. I find a spot in the shadows of the mezzanine where I can watch the ballroom without being seen. I see Victor through the glass doors. He looks older and a bit more tired than I remember, but his arrogance is still there, shining brighter than the crystal chandeliers. He is holding a glass of vintage champagne and laughing loudly with a group of wealthy investors. He thinks he is untouchable. He thinks he has won the game and that I am long gone. He has no idea that the man he threw away like a piece of garbage is standing just a few feet away, holding the key to his entire destruction in a coat pocket. The air in the ballroom is thick with the smell of expensive perfume and massive egos. I can hear the music playing, a soft string quartet that makes everything feel refined and perfectly safe. But I can also hear the sound of the water pumps in the basement struggling to keep up with the demand. It is a sound only an engineer would ever notice. It is a warning. The system is failing, and Victor is too busy basking in the spotlight to realize that his entire empire is built on a foundation of lies and cheap parts. I take a deep breath and step closer to the light. I'm not afraid of him anymore. I have spent 2 years in the dark, and I have learned that the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Victor thinks he is the king of the world tonight, but the world is about to remind him that you cannot build a future on a stolen dream. I am Arthur Penhaligon, and I am about to show every person in this room what a humble secret can really do. The gala is finally reaching its peak. The lights dim slightly and Victor is being called to the center of the stage. The applause is deafening, filling the room with a roar of approval. But all I can hear is the frantic, rhythmic clicking of a high-pressure valve that is about to burst in the floor below us. I reach into my pocket and touch the cold, honest metal of my invention. This is the moment where everything changes for both of us. This is the moment where karma finally comes to collect its heavy debt. I step out from the shadows and start walking toward the main doors. The guards are busy looking at the stage, and for a split second, I am completely invisible. I am just a ghost from the past, coming back to haunt the man who thought he could kill a dream. As I push open the heavy oak doors, the bright, blinding lights of the ballroom hit me full in the face. I see the faces of the people who used to be my peers and my colleagues. I see the confusion and the disgust in their eyes as they look at my tattered clothes and my unkempt hair. And then, I see Victor. He stops mid-sentence, his face turning a ghostly, sickly shade of white as he recognizes me. The room goes completely silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. He tries to recover his composure, tries to make a cruel joke about the help getting lost, but his voice cracks and fails him. He knows that the man he ruined is back, and he knows that I am not here to ask for a handout or a second chance. I am here to take back exactly what belongs to me. And the first leak in his perfect life was about to become a flood. I remember the way the sun used to hit the mahogany desk in my corner office on the 52nd floor. It was a beautiful, deep red wood that smelled like lemon wax and success. From that window, I could see the entire city of Chicago spread out like a map of my own achievements. I was Arthur Penhaligon, the man who had cracked the code on the Skyglider engine. It was supposed to be the future of flight, a machine so quiet and clean, it would make the old jet engines look like steam locomotives. I had spent 10 years of my life pouring every ounce of my brain and soul into those blueprints. I thought I was on top of the world, and I thought I had the best partner a man could ask for in Victor Thorne. Victor was 30 years younger than me, sharp as a razor and twice as shiny. I had plucked him out of a junior engineering pool because I saw something in him that reminded me of my younger self. He had that hunger, that drive to build something that mattered. For 5 years, I treated him like a son. I brought him into my home for Thanksgiving dinners. I taught him how to read a pressure gauge by feel and how to trust his gut. When the computer model said one thing, but the metal said another, I shared my secret notes with him, the little scribbles in the margins of my notebooks that held the real magic of the Skyglider. I trusted him with my life work, never realizing that while I was looking at the stars, he was looking at my wallet. The day it all came crashing down started out like any other Tuesday. I had my coffee, black and hot, and I was looking over the final test results for our prototype. Victor walked into my office, but he wasn't alone. He had 2 men in dark suits with him, and the CEO of our parent company, a man I had known for 20 years, was standing behind them with a look on his face that made my stomach drop. Nobody said good morning. Nobody asked how the test went. One of the men in suits stepped forward and told me I was being placed under immediate suspension pending a criminal investigation into corporate espionage. I laughed at first. I actually laughed because I thought it was some kind of elaborate birthday prank. I looked at Victor, waiting for him to crack a smile and tell me they got me good. But Victor didn't smile. He looked at the floor, his face twisted into a mask of fake disappointment. He told the CEO that he had found the digital trail on my private server. He said he had discovered emails where I was negotiating to sell the Skyglider designs to a rival firm in Beijing for $40 million. He even produced a set of bank statements showing offshore accounts in my name that I had never seen in my life. The room started to spin. I tried to explain that it was impossible, that I didn't even know how to set up an offshore account. But they wouldn't let me speak. The guards moved in and told me to keep my hands where they could see them. They stripped the security badge right off my lapel, the one I had worn with pride for 3 decades. They wouldn't even let me take my coat or the framed picture of my late wife from my desk. I was marched through the main engineering floor, past the young interns who looked up to me, past the secretaries who used to bring me cookies, and straight out the front doors like a common thief. Victor followed us all the way to the curb. Just before the security guards pushed me toward the sidewalk, he leaned in close so only I could hear him. He didn't sound sad anymore. His voice was cold and sharp, like a knife twisting in my ribs. He whispered that the world didn't need an old dinosaur like me anymore, and that the Skyglider belonged to him now. He told me I should have retired when I had the chance. Then he turned around and walked back into the building that used to be my second home, leaving me standing there in the rain without so much as an umbrella. The next few months were a blur of lawyers and cold rooms, Victor had done a thorough job. The digital evidence was perfect. He had used my own passwords, my own writing style, and even time-stamped the emails for when I was alone in the office late at night. Every friend I thought I had suddenly stopped answering my calls. My bank accounts were frozen by the government, and the legal fees to fight the charges ate up every penny of my savings in a matter of weeks. I had to sell my house, the one where I had raised my children and said goodbye to my wife, just to keep the lights on for another month. But even that wasn't enough. The board of directors sued me for damages, claiming I had devalued the company. They took the house, they took my car, and they even took the pension I had spent 30 years building. By the time the dust settled, the charges were dropped because of a lack of physical evidence, but the damage was done. My reputation was a blackened charcoal remains. No engineering firm would touch me, no bank would lend to me. I was a pariah in the only industry I had ever known. I remember the final day in my empty house. I sat on the floor of the living room because the furniture had all been hauled away that morning. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I had a small duffel bag with a change of clothes, a few old tools I managed to hide in the basement, and a folder of my original hand-drawn sketches that Victor had missed because they were tucked behind a loose brick in the garage. That was all I had left of a 60-year life. I walked out the front door, turned the key in the lock for the last time, and left it under the mat for the bank. I walked until my shoes felt like lead. I didn't have anywhere to go. No family left to lean on, and too much pride to ask for a handout from the few people who still recognized me. As the sun began to set over the city, I found myself sitting on a cold metal bench in a park near the train tracks. The wind coming off the lake was biting, a damp chill that seeped right through my thin jacket and settled into my bones. I watched people in suits rushing home to their warm dinners and their soft beds, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was invisible to them. I was no longer Arthur Penhaligon, the genius engineer. I was just a man on a bench. I spent my first night huddled under a piece of discarded cardboard behind a dumpster to stay out of the wind. The smell of rotting vegetables and wet paper was my new reality. I lay there with my heart pounding in my chest, wondering how a man could go from designing the future of humanity to hiding in the trash in less than a year. But as I clutched my bag of old tools to my chest, a small spark of the old Arthur flickered to life. Victor Thorne thought he had taken everything from me, but he had forgotten one thing. He had left me with the one tool he could never forge or steal. He had left me with my mind, and as the first light of a gray morning began to creep over the alleyway, I saw something glinting in the pile of junk next to me that gave me an idea. The morning air in Chicago has a way of biting through a thin coat like a stray dog that hasn't eaten in a week. I woke up on a pile of damp cardboard, my joints stiff and my back aching in places I didn't even know I had muscles. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. I reached out my hand, expecting to feel the soft, high thread count sheets of my king-sized bed, but all I felt was the cold, gritty concrete of an alleyway near Union Station. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and looked at my hands. They were covered in dirt and grease, a far cry from the manicured hands that used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. But as I looked at those hands, I realized they were still the same hands that had built the most advanced engines in the world. Victor Thorne had taken my money, my house, and my reputation, but he hadn't been able to reach inside my skull and take my brain. I spent the first few hours of the day doing what I called my morning rounds. To anyone else, I was just a homeless man scavenging for food or aluminum cans, but I was looking for much more than that. I was looking for the pieces of my future. I found a discarded copper coil behind a plumbing supply shop, its surface green with oxidation, but its soul still pure and conductive. I tucked it into my bag like it was a bar of solid gold. A few blocks away, near a construction site, I spotted a heavy-duty plastic jug and a length of rubber tubing that had been tossed aside because of a tiny leak. I could fix a leak like that in my sleep. By noon, I had a collection of treasures that most people would call trash. A handful of activated charcoal from a burnt-out grill in the park, some fine mesh screen from a broken window, and a small solar panel from a discarded garden light. My new laboratory was a corner of a basement in an old, forgotten textile warehouse. The owner didn't even know the space existed, hidden behind a heavy steel door that had rusted shut years ago. I had figured out how to jimmy the lock using a piece of a wire coat hanger. It was damp and smelled like wet wool and history, but it was dry and quiet. I cleared off a space on an old wooden crate and began to work. I didn't have a laser-guided assembly line or a team of technicians in white lab coats anymore. I had a pair of rusty pliers, a dull pocket knife, and a mind that could see the invisible flow of molecules. I started by cleaning the copper coil. I used a bit of vinegar I'd saved from a fast food packet and a scrap of denim to scrub away the green crust until the metal shone with a dull, honest glow. As I worked, I thought about the Sky Glider engine. Victor was probably out there right now, showing off a prototype that didn't quite work right because he didn't understand the heat exchange ratios. He always was a man who preferred the shine of a finished product over the grit of the process. He didn't realize that the secret to greatness is often found in the smallest, humblest details. I spent 3 days building the first version of what I called the Lazarus filter. I used the plastic jug as the main housing, layering the charcoal, the sand I'd gathered from a playground, and the fine mesh in a very specific sequence. The copper coil was the heart of the system. I rigged it so that the solar panel would provide just enough energy to create a small electrical charge, helping to pull heavy metals out of the water. It was a simple design, based on the same principles I'd used for the cooling systems on high-altitude jets, but adapted for the most basic human need: clean water. My friend Sam, an old man who had been living on the streets much longer than I had, watched me from the corner where he kept his blankets. He thought I was losing my mind. He'd seen me talking to myself while I measured the flow rate of the tubing using a discarded stopwatch. He asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was making a miracle. He just laughed and went back to his crossword puzzle, but I could tell he was curious. Life on the street makes you skeptical of everything, but it also makes you desperate for a reason to hope. The water in our part of the city was terrible. The pipes were old, and the runoff from the nearby industrial plants made the puddles oily and gray. I saw a mother and her young daughter living under the bridge a few blocks away, and it broke my heart to see them trying to boil water over a small fire that barely gave off any heat. They were getting sick, their eyes sunken and their skin pale. That was when I knew I couldn't just sit in my basement and feel sorry for myself. I had to see if my little invention actually worked. I went out into the rain and collected a bucket of the nastiest, grimiest water I could find. It was a murky soup of oil, dirt, and God knows what else. I brought it back to my crate and poured it into the top of the Lazarus filter. Sam stood up and walked over, his eyes wide as he watched the dirty water disappear into the layers of charcoal and mesh. For a long time, nothing happened. We just stood there in the dim light of the basement, the only sound being the distant rumble of the subway and the steady drip of a leaky pipe in the ceiling. Then, a single drop appeared at the end of the copper tube. It was slow and heavy, hanging there for a second before falling into the clean glass jar I'd found. It was followed by another, and then another. The water wasn't gray, it wasn't oily. It was as clear as a mountain spring, sparkling in the light of my small flashlight like a diamond. I picked up the jar and held it up to the light. There wasn't a speck of dust or a hint of cloudiness in it. I took a sip. It was the best water I had ever tasted in my entire life. It was cold, crisp, and pure. I handed the jar to Sam, and his hands shook as he took a drink. He looked at me with a mix of awe and confusion, as if I had just turned lead into gold right in front of him. He asked me how I did it, and I just smiled and told him that sometimes you have to lose everything to see what really matters. But as I sat there, enjoying the first real victory I'd had in a year, a shadow crossed a small window at the top of the basement wall. I heard the sound of a heavy car door slamming and the unmistakable click of expensive leather shoes on the pavement above. I realized that while I was busy building my miracle, the world I had left behind was starting to look for me. Victor Thorne wasn't done with me yet, and the secret I was holding in my hands was about to become much more dangerous than a simple water filter. I looked at the clear water and then at the rusted door, wondering if the man who stole my past was about to come for my future. I woke up the next morning feeling a strange sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. The clear water in that glass jar was more than just a drink. It was proof that I still existed. It was proof that Victor Thorne might have taken my name, but he couldn't take my soul. I knew I needed more materials if I was going to build enough filters for the whole camp under the bridge. The Lazarus filter worked, but the copper coil I'd salvaged was starting to show signs of stress, and I needed a more robust way to house the charcoal layers. So, I grabbed my old creaky shopping cart and headed out into the bright, cold Chicago sun. To the world, I was a walking eyesore. I had on 3 layers of mismatched coats, a pair of boots held together by duct tape, and a beard that had grown wild and gray over the last 2 years. As I pushed my cart down the sidewalk, the wheels made a high-pitched screeching sound that seemed to announce my arrival to everyone within 3 blocks. I didn't mind the noise. In my head, that screeching was the sound of a turbine spinning up to full power. I was looking for very specific things: discarded heating elements from old toasters, stainless steel mesh from broken kitchen strainers, and high-density plastic piping. I stopped near a pile of construction debris outside a new high-rise development. The building was all glass and steel, the kind of place where people like Victor lived. I saw a length of discarded copper pipe peeking out from under a pile of drywall, and my heart skipped a beat. It was perfect. I leaned over the edge of the dumpster, reaching deep into the rubble to pull it out. I must have looked like a man obsessed, my legs kicking in the air as I strained to reach the prize. That was when I heard the laughter. It was a sharp, shallow sound, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has never had to work for anything in their life. I pulled myself out of the dumpster, clutching the copper pipe to my chest, and saw a group of 3 young people standing on the sidewalk. They were dressed in expensive gym clothes that had probably never seen a drop of sweat. One of them, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a watch that cost more than a year of my old salary, was holding up a smartphone. He was filming me. "Look at this guy," the young man said, his voice dripping with a fake kind of pity. "He is literally diving for trash like it is buried treasure. Hey, old-timer, you find any gold in there? Or are you just building a spaceship to get away from the rest of us?" His friends giggled, and the girl next to him leaned in close to the camera. She was wearing a coat that looked like it was made of clouds. "Isn't it just so sad?" she whispered, though she made sure her voice was loud enough for me to hear. "This is what happens when you don't have a safety net. He probably thinks that pipe is a magic wand." I didn't say anything. I just looked at them with a calm, steady gaze. I saw the way the young man held his phone, the way the light reflected off the lens, and I realized he was probably one of those influencers who made videos about the city. He wasn't seeing a human being. He was seeing content. He was seeing a way to get a few thousand likes by mocking someone he thought was beneath him. I placed the copper pipe carefully into my cart and started to move on, but he followed me for a few steps, still filming. "Give us a smile, Einstein," he shouted. "Tell the camera what you are building. Is it a time machine? Are you going back to when you had a job?" I kept walking. I didn't feel angry. Honestly, I felt a little bit sorry for them. They were so focused on the surface of things that they couldn't see the world of possibilities hidden in a pile of scrap metal. They saw a crazy old man with a cart full of junk. I saw a solution to a water crisis. They saw a tragedy. I saw a triumph of engineering. I turned the corner and headed toward the public library. leaving their laughter behind me. Inside the library, it was warm and smelled like old paper and floor wax. I used one of the public computers, a slow machine that hummed like it was tired of living. I wanted to see if there was any news about Thorn Aerospace. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There was a headline about a massive contract Victor had just signed to install his version of the Skyglider technology in a new fleet of private jets. There was a picture of him standing in front of a shiny prototype, wearing a tuxedo and holding a glass of champagne. He looked smug. He looked like a man who thought he had gotten away with everything. But as I scrolled down the page, a small video in the sidebar caught my eye. The title read, "Local homeless man thinks he is a scientist." I clicked on it and there I was. The video the young man had taken of me at the dumpster had already been posted. It had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. Most of them were cruel. People were calling me the garbage genius and making jokes about my clothes and my hair. Some people were saying how dangerous it was to have crazy people wandering the streets with metal pipes. I sat there for a long time, watching the video over and over. I watched myself diving into that dumpster, and I saw the look of pure, focused joy on my face when I found that copper pipe. The people in the comments saw a man who had lost his mind, but I saw a man who had found his purpose. I realized then that being invisible was my greatest strength. As long as the world thought I was a joke, they wouldn't see me coming. They wouldn't see the man who was about to dismantle Victor Thorn's empire with a few pieces of trash and a lot of patience. I closed the browser and stood up, feeling a new surge of energy. I didn't care about the viral video or the mean comments. In fact, I hoped Victor saw it. I hoped he laughed at it just like everyone else did. I wanted him to feel safe. I wanted him to think that Arthur Penhaligon was gone forever, replaced by a broken old man who played with garbage. I pushed my cart back toward my warehouse basement, the wheels singing their screeching song. When I got back, Sam was waiting for me. He had found an old tablet in a recycling bin that still had a little bit of battery life left. He showed me the video again, his face full of concern. "Arthur, they are making fun of you," he said, his voice soft. "Do you want me to help you hide the cart? Maybe you should stay inside for a few days until people forget." I patted Sam on the shoulder and gave him a warm smile. "Let them laugh, Sam. A man who is being laughed at is a man who isn't being watched. And believe me, the last thing Victor Thorn wants to do right now is watch me." I spent the rest of the evening working on the new filter housing. I used the stainless steel mesh to create a multi-stage filtration system that was even more efficient than the first one. I worked by the light of a single candle, my shadow dancing on the damp brick walls. Every time I tightened a bolt or soldered a connection, I thought about that video. I thought about the thousands of people who were laughing at the garbage genius. I was almost finished with the second prototype when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the screech of my cart or the rumble of the subway. It was the sound of a heavy, high-end car idling in the alleyway, right outside my basement window. Then I heard a voice I recognized instantly. It was a voice that had once told me I was like a father to him. But now it sounded like ice scraping against a window pane. "Are you sure this is the place?" the voice asked. The video said he was seen around here. My heart hammered against my ribs. I blew out the candle and crouched down in the darkness, my hand gripping the cold copper pipe. Victor Thorn was outside. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was looking for me, and I realized that my humble secret might not stay secret for much longer. I stayed perfectly still, listening to the sound of his expensive shoes hitting the pavement just inches from my head. The hunter was at the door, but he had no idea that the prey was the one who had set the trap. I stayed as still as a stone in the deep shadows of the warehouse basement. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but it wasn't out of fear. It was more like the steady beat of a drum before a big performance. The engine of the car outside was idling with a soft, expensive purr that I recognized instantly. It was a Thorn Aerospace executive transport, the kind with the reinforced glass and the custom leather interior that smelled like success and a complete lack of a conscience. I could hear the muffled voices coming through the small, high window. Victor was out there, but he wasn't alone. He had brought Marcus with him. Marcus was a man I had hired myself back in the day. He was a decent enough engineer, I suppose, but he was a much better politician. He knew exactly whose boots to lick and which way the wind was blowing. When Victor staged his little coup and kicked me out, Marcus was the first one to step up and offer to help clean out my office. He didn't even have the decency to look sad about it. He just wanted my parking spot. Hearing his voice now, sharp and annoying like a mosquito in your ear, made me realize that some things never change. The heavy steel door of the basement groaned as Marcus pushed against it. I had left it unlocked on purpose. If you want to catch a rat, you have to leave the pantry door open just a crack. He stepped inside, and I could hear him coughing as the dust from the old warehouse hit his lungs. He was probably wearing a suit that cost 3 months of my current rent, and the thought of him getting cobwebs on his silk tie made me want to chuckle. He clicked on a high-powered flashlight, and a beam of bright white light cut through the darkness like a laser. It danced across the damp brick walls, the piles of old rags, and finally landed right on my workbench. There it was, the second prototype of the Lazarus filter, sitting right in the middle of the room like a crown jewel sitting on a pile of dirt. I had spent the last 4 hours making it look just a little bit more primitive than it actually was. I'd used some extra duct tape and a few pieces of bent wire to give it that crazy old man look. To someone like Marcus, who was used to clean rooms and chrome finishes, it probably looked like a middle school science project gone wrong. But I knew that as soon as he looked at the configuration of the copper coils, his heart would skip a beat. Marcus walked over to the bench, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the grit on the floor. I watched him through a gap in the old wooden crates I was hiding behind. He leaned over the device, the light from his flashlight reflecting off the copper. He let out a low whistle. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was an engineer, after all. He could see the logic in the layout. He could see the way the fluid dynamics were being handled in a way that defied the standard textbooks. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the main filtration chamber, his fingers tracing the lines I had designed in my head while sleeping on a park bench. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. I knew he was calling Victor. A second later, the car door outside slammed shut, and I heard the unmistakable sound of Victor's footsteps. He didn't wait. He marched right into the basement, his face flushed with a mix of anger and excitement. He looked around the room with a sneer of pure disgust, his eyes landing on me for a split second before he realized I wasn't there. He thought the room was empty. He thought I was out somewhere scavenging for more trash. "Is this it?" Victor asked, his voice echoing off the low ceiling. "Is this the miracle the internet is talking about?" Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the filter. "It is incredible, Victor. Look at the way he is using the copper to create a localized electromagnetic field. It is pulling the particulates out of the water before they even hit the charcoal layer. It is the same principle as the Sky Glider cooling system, but scaled down and simplified. The man is a lunatic, but he is still a genius. If this video keeps spreading, people are going to start asking questions about where he got the tech. They might start putting 2 and 2 together." Victor stepped closer, his shadow looming large against the wall. He looked at the filter, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the old Victor, the one who used to look at me with genuine admiration. But it was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by that cold, calculating stare that had cost me everything. He reached out and grabbed the device, lifting it up as if it weighed nothing. He didn't care about the science. He didn't care about the people it could save. All he saw was a threat to his brand and a new piece of intellectual property he could steal. "Take it," Victor said, his voice flat and hard. "Take everything. The device, the notes, even those scraps of paper over there. I want this room cleared out. If anyone asks, we are just cleaning up a public health hazard. We will take this back to the lab, strip it down, and file a patent for a new industrial water purification system before the sun comes up. By the time the old man realizes what happened, it will be our word against his, and nobody listens to a ghost. Marcus started grabbing my hand-drawn sketches and the extra copper tubing I had left out. They moved with a frantic kind of greed, stuffing my life's work into a heavy-duty plastic bag. They didn't even notice the small hidden camera I had rigged up using a discarded baby monitor and a battery pack. They were too busy being the big, powerful corporate masters, taking what they wanted from a man who had nothing. Victor stood there with the filter tucked under his arm, looking around the basement one last time with a smirk of triumph. He thought he had just won the game. He thought he had finally buried Arthur Penhaligon for good. I watched them carry the bag out to the car. I heard the trunk slam shut and the engine rev as they sped away, probably heading straight back to their glass tower to start the reverse engineering process. The basement was suddenly very quiet again, the only sound being the distant drip of water that they had forgotten to fix. I stayed in the shadows for a long time, letting the silence settle around me like a warm blanket. Finally, I stepped out from behind the crates. I walked over to the workbench and looked at the empty space where my filter had been. Most people would have been devastated. Most people would have sat down and cried, because their only hope had just been stolen by the man who had already taken everything else. But I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I reached under the workbench and pulled out a small, heavy box that I had hidden behind a loose brick. I opened it up, and there it was. The real Lazarus filter. The one Marcus and Victor had taken was a decoy. Oh, the physics were real enough, and it would definitely filter water. But I had built in a very specific flaw that only I knew about. I had used a type of copper alloy that looked identical to the high-grade stuff, but it had a much lower melting point when subjected to a specific electrical frequency. As soon as they tried to hook it up to their high-powered lab equipment and run a full stress test, the entire system would fuse together into a solid, useless lump of slag. And the best part? The blueprints I had left for them to find had the same flaw hidden in the math. They were going to spend millions trying to replicate a failure, and they were going to do it while my hidden camera recorded every single second of their corporate theft. I sat down on my old wooden stool and leaned back against the wall, a small, slow smile spreading across my face. Victor thought he was the one doing the hunting, but he had just walked right into the middle of my laboratory. He had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The garbage genius was about to become the one thing Victor Thorne feared most. A man with nothing left to lose and a very loud, very public platform to tell the truth. I picked up a glass of clear, pure water I had saved from earlier and took a slow, satisfying sip. The game wasn't over. In fact, it was just getting interesting. I looked up at the small window, watching the first light of dawn begin to color the sky. And I knew that today was the day the world was going to find out that some secrets are just too big to stay buried in the trash. I sat in the dark for a long time after the tail lights of Victor's car faded into the distance. The silence of the warehouse felt different now. It was the silence of being forgotten. It was the silence of a trap that had just snapped shut. I reached into the pocket of my oversized, greasy coat and pulled out a small, cracked smartphone. It was an old model, something I had found in a bin and repaired with bits of wire and a lot of patience. On the screen, the little red dot was still blinking. The hidden camera had captured everything. I watched the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light coming through the high window. It was funny, really. Victor thought he was so smart, so fast. He thought that by taking my physical work, he was taking my future. He never understood that the real work happens in the mind, and the objects we build are just shadows of that thought. I stood up and stretched my old, aching back. My joints popped like dry wood, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked over to the corner where I kept my most precious belongings tucked away in a waterproof bag. Inside that bag wasn't money or jewelry. It was a stack of dated notebooks filled with my handwriting, going back 3 years. Every single step of the Lazarus filter's development was there. I had documented every failure, every tiny adjustment, and every breakthrough. Most importantly, I had a series of photos I had taken at the public library, each one showing me holding a newspaper with the date clearly visible, standing next to the evolving prototype. I was a man who lived by the laws of physics, and I knew that the laws of man, while sometimes slow, eventually had to follow the evidence. I stepped out of the warehouse and into the cool morning air. The city was just starting to wake up. Delivery trucks were rumbling down the streets, and the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery made my stomach growl. I didn't mind. I had a different kind of hunger today. I walked 6 blocks to a small, unassuming office building where a light was already on in a second-floor window. This was the office of Ben Miller. Ben was a lawyer who had retired years ago, a man I had helped out when he was just starting his practice. He was the only person who had ever sent me a Christmas card after I lost everything. When I knocked on the glass door, Ben looked up from his desk. He stared at me for a long time, trying to find the man he knew under the layers of dirt and the wild gray beard. Then, his eyes hit mine, and he saw the spark. He didn't ask about my smell or my clothes. He just opened the door and pointed toward the coffee pot. I sat down in one of his leather chairs, feeling out of place but entirely at home. I pulled the small smartphone and the bag of notebooks out of my coat. I told him everything. I told him about the theft, about the video, and about the specific mathematical signature I had built into the filter. Ben listened with the kind of focus that made him a legend in the courtroom. He didn't interrupt. He just took notes, his pen scratching across the yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the screen of the phone, watching Victor Thorne's face as he laughed while stealing my work. "Arthur," Ben said softly, his voice full of a warm, quiet respect. "You didn't just build a water filter. You built a gallows. By stealing this specific version and, as we can already see on the preliminary patent office filings, claiming it as an original Thorne aerospace invention, Victor has legally trapped himself. He has claimed ownership of a design that we can prove, through these notebooks and the library records, existed under your hand long before he ever saw it. In the eyes of the law, he hasn't just stolen property. He has committed a fraud so massive it will pull his entire company down with him." We spent the next few hours preparing the initial filings. It was a strange feeling, sitting there in a quiet office, while the rest of the world went about its business. I felt like a ghost who was finally getting his voice back. Ben worked with a fierce energy, his fingers flying over his keyboard. He explained that we weren't just going for a civil suit. This was criminal. This was a conspiracy to defraud and a clear case of intellectual property theft documented on high-definition video. Meanwhile, across the city in the gleaming glass tower of Thorne Aerospace, I knew exactly what was happening. Victor would be in his high-tech lab, surrounded by his best engineers. He would be standing over my stolen prototype, barking orders, and telling them to have a production model ready by the end of the week. He would be dreaming of the billions he was going to make, of the awards he was going to win, and of how he had finally scrubbed the name Arthur Penhaligon out of the history books. But then, the first problem would start. Marcus would try to hook up the sensors, and he would realize that the wiring didn't follow any standard logic. He would see the copper coils and try to run a current through them, only to find that the resistance was all wrong. They would start to realize that the machine they stole was much more complex than it looked. And then, the phone calls would start coming in. Ben had already sent the first legal notices. These weren't just letters, they were precision strikes. He sent them to the board of directors, to the major investors, and to the patent office. He included a single still frame from the video. Victor's face, clear as day, holding the filter in my basement. It was a picture that spoke 1,000 words, and every single one of them was a nail in Victor's professional coffin. I could almost see the color draining from Victor's face as his secretary walked into his office with the legal summons. I could see him dropping his expensive pen, his hands starting to shake as he realized that the crazy old man in the dumpster wasn't crazy at all. He had thought he was the one in control, the one holding all the cards. He never realized that I had been the one dealing the hand from the very beginning. The corporate giant was starting to realize that his feet were made of clay. He had spent years building a palace out of lies, and all it took was one honest man with a humble secret to bring the whole thing crashing down. Victor was no longer the king of the mountain. He was a man caught in a spotlight, and for the first time in his life, he had nowhere left to hide. The worried look on his face in that office wouldn't just be about the money or the company. It would be the look of a man who finally realized that you can't steal a man's genius, and you certainly can't outrun the truth when it's being told by someone who has nothing left to lose. As I walked back out onto the street, the sun was high in the sky. I felt the warmth on my face and smiled. It was a good day to be Arthur Penhaligon. The trap was set, the evidence was moving, and the man who thought he was untouchable was about to find out just how heavy the weight of justice can be. But as I turned the corner toward my warehouse, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A black car was parked right in front of the entrance, and a woman I didn't recognize was standing there, waiting for me. She didn't look like a lawyer, and she didn't look like one of Victor's people. She looked like someone who had been looking for me for a very long time. The woman standing by the black car didn't look like she belonged in my alleyway. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with a crisp blue blazer and a tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. When she saw me, she didn't recoil or hold her nose. She actually stepped forward, her eyes scanning my face with a mix of curiosity and something that looked like desperate hope. She told me her name was Sarah and that she worked for the International Green Technology Summit. Apparently, that video of me diving into the dumpster had reached a lot further than just a few bored teenagers. Some people on her board of directors had looked past the dirt and the old coat. They saw the flow of the water in my little plastic jug. They saw the way I had rigged the copper coils. They wanted me to come to their conference at the Grand Convention Center downtown and show the world what I had built. I looked at her, then back at my warehouse. I had just spent the last few hours with my lawyer, setting a trap for Victor, and now the universe was handing me a silver platter. Sarah told me they would pay for my transport and that they were even willing to provide a new suit for me to wear. I smiled at her, a real warm smile that made the wrinkles around my eyes crinkle. I told her I would be happy to come, but I insisted on wearing my own clothes. I told her that if people wanted to see the invention, they needed to see the man who actually built it, not some cleaned-up version of him. She looked a bit nervous about that, probably imagining the wealthy donors complaining about the smell of the city streets in their pristine ballroom. But she nodded and gave me a polished business card. After she left, I went back inside and looked at myself in a cracked piece of a mirror. I wasn't the Arthur Penhaligon who used to fly first class to Paris. I was a man who had lived through the rain and the cold. I washed my face with the pure water from my filter, the very first drop of my own success. I trimmed my beard just a little bit, not enough to look corporate, but enough so people could see I was the man who had given up. I put on my best flannel shirt under my heavy coat and tucked the Real Lazarus filter into a sturdy canvas bag. My heart was racing, but my hands were as steady as the steel beams of a skyscraper. I knew that Victor would be at this summit. He was the golden boy of the industry now, and there was no way he would miss a chance to preen in front of the world leaders. The ride to the convention center was surreal. Sarah had sent a car for me, a quiet electric sedan that glided through the city's streets like a ghost. The driver kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, clearly wondering why a man who looked like he slept under a bridge was being chauffeured to the most expensive event of the year. I just stared out the window, watching the buildings go by. I saw the Thorn Aerospace logo on a billboard near the highway. It looked cold and sharp. I thought about the thousands of people who worked there, good people who believed in what they were doing, unaware that their leader was a thief. I felt a weight of responsibility. I wasn't just doing this for revenge. I was doing it to save the work I loved from being turned into a tool for greed. When we arrived at the convention center, the contrast was almost blinding. The floors were polished white marble that reflected the bright LED lights in the ceiling. There were huge banners hanging from the rafters, showing images of clean oceans and happy children. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the low, constant hum of 1,000 conversations. Men in suits that cost more than a small house were shaking hands and exchanging business cards. I walked through the lobby, my old boots making a dull thud on the floor. People actually stepped out of my way, some of them giving me a wide berth as if I were a ticking bomb. They had no idea that I was exactly that. I was ushered through a side door and into the backstage area. It was a maze of black curtains, thick cables, and young people with headsets running around like they were in a war zone. One of the stage managers, a tall man with a clipboard, looked at me and then at Sarah with a horrified expression. He asked if I was the prop for the human interest segment. Sarah just told him I was the main demonstration for the water section. He huffed and pointed toward a small table in the corner where I could set up my equipment. I sat there quietly, watching the monitors. Then I saw him. On the massive screen that faced the audience, a video started playing. It was a high-budget production full of dramatic music and slow-motion shots of clean water. And there was Victor Thorn. He was standing in a laboratory wearing a white coat, talking about a breakthrough in water purification. He was holding the decoy filter, the one he had stolen from my basement. He called it the Thorn Pure Flow System. He told the audience that his company had spent years and millions of dollars developing this technology to save the world. He looked so confident, so noble. The audience started to clap, a thunderous sound that echoed through the curtains and hit me in the chest. I felt a surge of cold, hard energy. He was actually doing it. He was standing in front of the world and claiming my soul as his own invention. He didn't know I was there. He thought I was still hiding in the dark, probably crying over my lost trash. The stage manager came over and told me I was up next. He said I had 5 minutes to show my little DIY project, and then I had to clear the stage for the keynote speaker, which was, of course, Victor himself. I picked up my canvas bag and felt the weight of the copper and the charcoal. I walked toward the edge of the stage. The bright lights were reflecting off the floor, making it look like I was walking onto a lake of fire. I could hear the announcer's voice over the speakers, introducing the garbage genius, who had become an internet sensation. He sounded a bit patronizing, like he was introducing a circus act. I took a deep breath. I thought about Sam back at the warehouse, and the mother and child under the bridge who were finally drinking clean water because of me. I thought about the years of work and the betrayal that had tried to bury me. I stepped out from behind the curtain. The light was so bright I had to squint for a second. The room was massive, a sea of faces stretching back into the darkness. I could see the VIP section right at the front, and there, sitting in the very middle with a wide, arrogant smile on his face, was Victor Thorn. He was whispering something to the woman next to him, laughing. He didn't even look up at first. He just thought another nobody was taking the stage. I walked to the center, placed my canvas bag on the podium, and looked directly at the camera. The silence that fell over that room was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a secret about to be told. I reached into the bag, pulled out the real Lazarus filter, and for the first time in 2 years, I spoke into a microphone that reached the whole world. I didn't start with a greeting. I started with the one thing Victor never expected to hear from a man he thought he had destroyed. I started with the truth. I stood there for a long moment, just letting the silence stretch out across that massive, air-conditioned hall. The microphone felt cold and heavy in my hand, a solid piece of reality in a room full of expensive illusions. I looked down at the front row, and my heart gave a steady, rhythmic thrum. Victor was still leaning back in his velvet-covered chair, looking at his phone with a bored expression, probably checking the latest stock prices for Thorn Aerospace after his big presentation. He had no idea the man standing 10 feet away from him, covered in the dust of the city and wearing a coat held together by hope and duct tape, was the very ghost he thought he had buried in the mud 2 years ago. I cleared my throat, and the sound echoed through the speakers like a crack of thunder, making a few people in the back jump in their seats. I did not start with a fancy greeting or a thank you to the organizers. I just looked directly into the main camera lens, the one broadcasting this event to millions of people on the internet, and I let my voice carry the weight of everything I had been through. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon," I said, and my voice was as clear and sharp as a mountain stream. "You might remember me as the man who was accused of selling his country's most precious secrets. You might remember me as the man who was stripped of his company, his home, and his pride because of a mountain of digital lies. But for the last 2 years, the people living in the shadows of this city have known me by a different name. They call me the garbage genius." I saw Victor's head snap up so fast I thought he might get whiplash. His expensive smartphone slipped from his fingers and hit the plush carpet with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden, dead silence of the room. The woman sitting next to him, his high-priced head of public relations, leaned forward so far she nearly fell out of her chair. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the giant screen behind me. The whispers started then, a low, buzzing sound like a swarm of angry bees. People were pulling out their phones, frantically searching my name, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, as they realized who was actually standing on that stage. I did not give them time to process the shock. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the Lazarus filter. It looked completely ridiculous sitting on that high-tech, polished mahogany podium. It was a simple plastic jug I had found in a recycling bin, wrapped in layers of old copper wire I had scrubbed clean with vinegar and salt. I held it up high so the cameras could get a good look at the jagged edges and the mismatched parts. "This is not a $10 million project," I told them, my voice filled with a warm, quiet pride. This did not come from a clean room or a laboratory filled with scientists in white coats. This came from the gutters of Chicago. This came from the things you throw away because you think they have no value. I began to explain the science, but I kept it simple, the way I used to explain things to my children when they were small. I told them about the charcoal I had scavenged from burnt-out grills in the public parks and how I had processed it to trap the toxins that make people sick. I showed them the fine mesh I had taken from a discarded screen door, layered in a specific way to catch the heavy grit. But then I pointed to the copper coils. I explained how a tiny, almost invisible pulse of static electricity, harvested from a small solar cell I found in a broken garden light, could create a field that pulled heavy metals and led out of the water like a magnet. The audience was leaning in now. The mockery I had seen earlier, the smirks and the sideways glances at my tattered clothes, had completely vanished. They weren't looking at a homeless man anymore. They were looking at a master at work. I pulled out a clear glass jar I had filled with water from a stagnant, oily puddle behind the convention center earlier that morning. It was a murky, brownish soup that smelled of old rubber and rot. I poured it into the top of the plastic jug. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the giant LED screens. A few seconds later, a steady stream of water began to trickle out of the bottom tube. It was crystal clear, sparkling under the stage lights like a liquid diamond. I picked up the glass, took a long, slow drink, and the entire audience let out a collective gasp that sounded like a wind through the trees. I told them about the families living under the bridges, the ones who had been drinking gray water for months because they had no other choice. I told them that true engineering isn't about building the most expensive toy for the wealthiest people. It is about finding a way to keep a child from getting a fever because of a glass of water. I saw a woman in the third row, a wealthy donor in a silk dress, quietly wipe a tear from her cheek. The energy in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer a corporate gala. It was a moment of pure, undeniable truth. Then I turned my gaze directly toward Victor. He was sitting perfectly still, his face a mask of pale, frozen terror. He looked like he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. I pointed a finger at the massive screen behind me, where the Thorn PureFlow system was still being displayed in all its chrome-plated glory. I told the crowd that the machine they had just seen, the one Victor claimed to have invented after years of research, was nothing more than a stolen shadow of the device I was holding in my hand. I explained that the blueprints Victor was using were flawed because he had stolen them before I could finish the final safety calculations. I told the audience that if anyone tried to run the Thorn system at full capacity, the copper alloys would react to the electrical frequency and fuse the entire machine into a solid, useless lump of slag within minutes. I saw the representative from the National Patent Office, a man who had been laughing and shaking Victor's hand only an hour ago, go absolutely white. He was sitting in the second row, and he suddenly looked like he had been struck by lightning. He began to frantically type on his laptop, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hit the keys. He looked up at me, then at the frozen, sweating man beside him, and the realization of the massive fraud he had almost certified began to sink in. The golden boy of the aerospace world was melting away under the bright lights, and for the first time in 2 years, the man in the trash heap coat was the only one in the room who could hold his head high. Victor's representative looked like he was about to be sick, his face turning a sickly shade of green, as he realized that the Thorn Empire was built on a foundation of stolen sand that was currently washing away in front of the whole world. The weeks that followed the summit were a whirlwind of activity that most people only see in the movies. Ben Miller did not waste a single second. He moved through the legal system like a man with a mission, filing motions and serving papers before Victor Thorn could even get his shoes back on. The news of what happened on that stage spread like a wildfire across the country. It was not just a story about a water filter anymore. It was a story about the little guy, the man the world had forgotten, standing up and pointing a finger at the giant who had tried to crush him. I stayed in a small, quiet room that Ben had arranged for me, a place with clean sheets and a window that looked out over a small park. It was strange to sleep in a real bed again. For the first few nights, I actually found myself sitting on the floor because the mattress felt too soft, too much like a dream I might wake up from at any moment. Ben would come over every evening with a stack of papers and a bag of sandwiches, his face glowing with a quiet, fierce joy. He told me that the evidence from my hidden camera was being hailed as the smoking gun of the century. You see, the law has a lot of complicated words for what Victor did. But at the end of the day, it was just plain old stealing. And because he had filed those patent applications under the name of Thorn Aerospace, he had committed a federal crime. The authorities did not just want to sue him, they wanted to take him apart. We had the notebooks, we had the library records, and most importantly, we had the video of Victor laughing while he carried my lifework out of a damp basement. It was a beautiful thing to see the truth finally catch up with a man who thought he was faster than the light. Then came the day of the great meltdown. I call it that, because that is exactly what happened to Victor's pride and his bank account. Just as I had predicted, the engineers at Thorn Aerospace had tried to force the stolen prototype into production. They were under immense pressure from the board of directors to prove that I was lying on that stage. They hooked the machine up to their high-powered industrial grid, bypassing the safety protocols I had carefully built into the design. They thought they could just pump more power into it to make it work faster. But physics does not care about your ego or your quarterly earnings. The specific copper alloy I had used in that decoy filter reacted exactly the way it was supposed to. It reached a critical temperature, and within 3 minutes, the entire internal system fused into a single solid lump of useless metal. The report from the fire marshal was the final nail in the coffin. It proved that the design Victor claimed as his own was not only stolen, but fundamentally misunderstood by the person who stole it. The board of directors did not even wait for a trial. They turned on Victor like a pack of wolves. They realized that their investment was gone, and that their brand was now synonymous with fraud and incompetence. One by one, the major contracts for the Sky Glider engine were cancelled. Airlines did not want to be associated with a thief, and the government certainly did not want their planes falling out of the sky because of a flawed cooling system. The stock price of Thorn Aerospace did not just drop, it evaporated. It went from $100 a share to pennies in a matter of days. I remember sitting in Ben's office when the news came through that the company was filing for bankruptcy. I did not feel a surge of anger or a need to shout from the rooftops. I just felt a quiet, deep sense of peace. I watched the television as the reporters stood outside the glass tower that used to have my name on the lease. They were filming the employees walking out with their boxes, their faces full of confusion and worry. I felt bad for them. They were good people who had been led by a man with a hollow heart. I told Ben that I wanted to make sure the lower-level staff were taken care of, and he promised me that we would make that a priority in the settlement. Victor tried to fight it at first. He hired the most expensive lawyers money could buy, men in suits that cost more than a house, who tried to argue that I was a disgruntled former employee who had set him up. But every time they opened their mouths, Ben would just play another clip from the basement video. He would show the part where Victor said that nobody listens to a ghost. The jury, when they were finally seated for the preliminary hearings, looked at Victor with a kind of disgust that you usually reserve for something you find under a rock. His lawyers eventually realized they were on a sinking ship and started looking for a way to settle. But I did not want their money. I wanted the truth to be the only thing left standing. The day the court finally ordered the seizure of all Thorn Aerospace assets was a gray, rainy Tuesday, much like the day I had been kicked out 2 years before. Ben and I drove over to the headquarters one last time. We did not go inside. We just sat in the car and watched as the federal marshals walked through those big glass doors. They were carrying heavy chains and big yellow padlocks. I watched as 2 workers in orange vests climbed up on a ladder and started to pry the big chrome letters of the Thorn name off the front of the building. One of the letters, a big, shiny T, fell to the pavement and shattered into a dozen pieces. It looked like a broken toy. Victor was let out a side exit a few minutes later. He was not wearing his expensive tuxedo or his gold watch. He was wearing a plain gray suit that looked a size too big for him, and his hair was messy, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. He looked small. He looked like the frightened, greedy boy I had met all those years ago, before I let my own kindness blind me to his nature. He did not look at the cameras, and he certainly did not look at the car where I was sitting. He was put into the back of a black sedan and driven away to face the criminal charges that would likely keep him behind bars for a very long time. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. The engine of Ben's car hummed quietly, a steady and honest sound. I thought about the warehouse basement and the smell of the damp brick. I thought about the people under the bridge who were probably still using the filters I had built for them. I realized that the building behind me was just a pile of glass and steel. The real company, the real innovation, had never lived in those offices. It had lived in the work, and the work was finally back in the right hands. Ben patted me on the shoulder and asked me if I was ready to go. I told him I was, but I asked him to stop at a hardware store on the way back. I had a few ideas for a new solar array that could make the Lazarus filter work even in the dead of winter. As we pulled away from the curb, leaving the empty building behind us, I felt a strange sensation of being watched. I looked out the side window and saw a man standing on the corner. He was dressed in a long, dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He was not a reporter, and he certainly was not a former employee. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching our car as it merged into traffic. He did not wave, and he did not move. But there was something about the way he stood that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I watched him until he disappeared from view, wondering if the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. I had my name back, and I had my life back. But the world was suddenly feeling a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than it had been when I was just a man in an alleyway. Just as I started to relax, my old phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from an unknown number that said, "We have been waiting for you to finish your business with the amateur." Now, let us talk about the real future. I remember pulling up to the driveway of my old house on Oak Street. It was a big, white Victorian with a wraparound porch that I used to paint myself every 3 years, usually while complaining about the humidity and the bees. The bank had kept it in decent shape, probably hoping to flip it for a big profit once the scandal died down, but it looked lonely. The garden was overgrown with weeds that reached up like desperate hands, and the windows were dark, like eyes that had forgotten how to see the light. I stood there for a long time, just clutching the keys in my pocket. They were the original keys, returned to me by a court officer with a polite nod and a look of genuine pity. I didn't want his pity, but I took the keys. I walked up the porch steps and my boots made a hollow, echoing sound on the wood. It was a sound I hadn't heard in 2 years. I put the key in the lock, and for a second, I was afraid it wouldn't turn. I was afraid the house had moved on without me. But the lock clicked open with a smooth, familiar snap, and I stepped inside. The air was still and smelled of floor wax, old books, and a faint hint of the lavender sachets my wife used to hide in the coat closet. It was the smell of my entire life. I walked into the living room and saw the squares of lighter paint on the walls where my family photos used to hang. Victor had sold off almost everything I owned, but he couldn't sell the way the afternoon sun hit the hardwood floors. I walked through the kitchen and ran my hand over the granite countertop. It was cold, but it felt like home. I remembered the mornings I'd spent there, drinking coffee and sketching out wing designs on napkins while the kids ate breakfast. Back then, I thought I was invincible. I thought the walls of this house were thick enough to keep out the world. I was wrong about that, but standing there now, I realized that the house hadn't failed me. I had just been away on a very long, very difficult trip. The phone in my pocket started buzzing. It hadn't stopped for 3 days. It was funny how many friends I suddenly had. Men who wouldn't have crossed the street to help me when I was sleeping on cardboard were now calling me Arthur and asking if I wanted to grab lunch at the club. They talked about my resilience and my brilliant legal victory like it was a sports highlight reel. I didn't answer most of them. I didn't feel angry, exactly. I just felt different. When you've seen the world from the bottom of a dumpster, the view from the top of the mountain looks a lot less impressive. Ben Miller came over later that afternoon. He brought a box of pizza and a 6-pack of ginger ale because he knew I wasn't in the mood for a fancy celebration. We sat on the floor of the empty dining room, leaning our backs against the wall. He laid out the final settlement papers on a piece of greasy napkins. It was a staggering amount of money. Between the return of my stolen patents, the liquidated assets of Thorn Aerospace, and the massive punitive damages the judge had slapped on Victor, I was now one of the wealthiest men in the city. Ben looked at me and shook his head. "You could buy an island, Arthur," he said. "You could retire to a beach and never think about a copper pipe or a charcoal filter ever again. You've earned it." I looked at the numbers on the page and then I looked out the window at the quiet street. I thought about Sam back at the shelter, and the mother I'd seen under the bridge, and the way the water in the city drains looked like liquid poison. I told Ben I didn't want an island. I told him I wanted to buy the old warehouse where I'd hidden my lab, and I didn't just want the warehouse. I wanted the whole industrial block around it. I wanted to build something that the world had never seen before. That night was the first time I slept in a real bed in over 700 days. I had bought a simple mattress and some clean white sheets that smelled like fresh air. I lay there in the dark, and the silence was so loud it made my ears ring. There were no sirens, no shouting, no rumble of the subway through the floorboards. I felt the weight of the blankets, soft and heavy, and I realized how much energy I had spent just trying to stay warm for the last 2 years. I didn't fall asleep right away. I watched the shadows of the oak trees dancing on the bedroom ceiling, and I felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. I wasn't just Arthur Penhaligon again. I was someone new. I was a man who knew the value of a drop of water and the weight of a kind word. The next morning, I met Ben at his office to finalize the plans for the settlement money. The news had leaked that I was making a major announcement, and the lobby was full of reporters and city officials. They all expected me to announce a new high-tech aerospace firm. They thought I was going to build faster planes or better satellites. When I stepped up to the microphone, I could see the greed in their eyes. They wanted a piece of the comeback story. I looked them all in the eye and told them I was founding the Penhaligon Institute for Humble Technology. I told them I was taking 80% of my settlement money and putting it into a trust that would never be touched by a corporate board or a group of investors. We weren't going to build things for billionaires. We were going to hire the people the city had forgotten, the mechanics living in their cars, the engineers who had lost their way, the geniuses hiding in the alleys. We were going to build tools for the people who actually needed them. We were going to make the Lazarus filter a standard in every struggling neighborhood in the country. And we were going to do it for free. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. The reporters looked at each other, confused. One of them asked why I would give away my fortune when I could be the next industry giant. I just smiled at him and told him that I had already been a giant, and it was a very lonely place to be. I told them that the most sophisticated technology in the world is the kind that keeps a human being alive and gives them back their dignity. That was my decision, and it felt better than any contract I had ever signed in my life. I walked out of the office and back to my car, feeling lighter than I had in years. But as I was pulling out of the parking garage, a dark SUV with tinted windows blocked my path. A man in a very expensive, very sharp suit stepped out. He didn't look like a lawyer or a businessman. He had the look of someone who dealt in secrets and shadows. He walked over to my window and tapped on the glass. When I rolled it down, he didn't give me a business card. He showed me a high-resolution satellite photo of my warehouse lab, taken months ago, before the video went viral. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice as smooth as silk and as cold as ice. "You think you're building water filters for the poor, and that's a very noble thing. But our analysts have looked at the frequency your copper coils were emitting during your little demonstration at the summit. You didn't just purify water, Arthur. You accidentally discovered a way to neutralize long-range radar signatures. You've created the most effective stealth coating in history, out of garbage and luck." He leaned in closer, and I could see my own worried reflection in his sunglasses. "Victor Thorne was an amateur, Arthur. He just wanted your money. The people I work for want your brain, and they don't take no for an answer. Now, shall we take a little drive?" I looked at the man in the sharp suit through the open window of my car, and I had to bite back a laugh. He was so serious, so full of his own importance, standing there with his satellite photos and his talk of national security. For a second, I thought about the old Arthur, the one who would have been terrified or maybe even a little bit flattered that the big boys in the shadows wanted his brain, but that Arthur had been buried under a pile of damp cardboard and city soot a long time ago. I leaned back against the headrest of my seat and just stared at him. I told him that it was funny how the world worked. I spent my whole life trying to make planes fly better, and nobody cared until I started playing with trash in an alley. Then suddenly, I am the most important man in the room again. He did not like that. He wanted me to be afraid. He told me that the frequency I had discovered was worth more than the entire city of Chicago. He said that the people he represented did not just buy things, they owned them. I looked at the photo he was holding. It was a grainy shot of my warehouse, the place where I had sweated and shivered and dreamed. I realized then that they could take the warehouse. They could take the copper and the charcoal. They could even take me and put me in a room with a locked door and all the fancy equipment I could ever want. But they could not take the way I saw the world. I reached out and took the photo from his hand. I ripped it into 4 pieces and handed them back to him. I told him that the frequency he was so worried about was a fluke of the materials. I used that specific type of copper because it was the only thing I could find in a dumpster behind a construction site. If he wanted to recreate it, he would have to find that exact dumpster on that exact day with that exact amount of oxidation on the metal. I told him that genius is not something you can bottle up and sell to the highest bidder. It is a response to the world around you. He looked at the torn pieces of the photo like I had just handed him a live grenade. I rolled up my window and drove away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the street, looking very small in his very expensive suit. I drove back to my white Victorian house on Oak Street. I spent the afternoon walking through the rooms, listening to the floorboards groan under my feet. It was a friendly sound, like the house was happy to have its owner back. I went up to the attic and found an old box of my wife's things that Victor had missed because it was tucked behind an old water heater. There was a photo of us on our wedding day, and a small wooden bird I had carved for her when we were first married and did not have a dime to our names. I sat on the dusty floor and held that bird in my hand. I realized that back then, I was already the man I am now. I just forgot it for a while because I got distracted by the shiny things and the big titles. The journey from that mahogany desk to the cold concrete of the alley was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the best thing that ever happened to me. In that high-rise office, I was surrounded by people who only cared about what I could do for their bottom line. I was a resource, a tool, a name on a contract. On the street, I was just Arthur, and as Arthur, I learned that the most powerful thing in the universe is not a jet engine or a stealth coating. It is the ability to see a need and fill it with whatever you have on hand. It is about the dignity of the person standing next to you. I think about Sam all the time. He is the head of maintenance at my new institute now. He wears a clean uniform and has a warm place to sleep, but he still carries his old crossword puzzles in his pocket. He told me the other day that the water from our new industrial filters tastes like a memory of home. That meant more to me than any award or any billion-dollar settlement ever could. We have hundreds of people working at the warehouse now. We do not call them employees, we call them partners. We have guys who used to fix tractors in small towns, and women who used to design circuit boards before they got laid off. We are building things that matter. We are building portable heaters that run on vegetable oil and solar-powered lanterns that can light up a whole village for the cost of a cup of coffee. Victor Thorne is sitting in a cell now, probably wondering where it all went wrong. He still thinks he lost because I was smarter or because I had a better lawyer. He will never understand that he lost because he thought he could steal a destination without making the journey. He thought the office and the title and the money were the things that made him powerful. He did not realize that those things are just the packaging. The real power is the spark that happens when you are backed into a corner and you refuse to give up. He had the blueprints, but he never had the soul of the machine. I stood on my porch tonight and watched the sun go down. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the first few stars were starting to peek through the city haze, I felt the weight of the house behind me, and the weight of the future in front of me. I know the men in the black SUVs will be back. I know the world will always try to take what I build and turn it into something cold and hard. But I am not worried. They can have the blueprints. They can have the patents. They can even have the old warehouse if they really want it. Because I know a secret that they will never understand. I know that you do not need a corner office on the 50th floor to change the world. You do not need a lab with $1 million worth of sensors and a team of assistants in white coats. You just need a problem that needs solving and the heart to see it through. I looked at the lights of the city and I smiled. I'm just an old man who likes to play with trash. But I have learned that the best ideas do not come from the places you would expect. They come from the cold, the dark, and the quiet corners where nobody is looking. They come from the people who have been told they are nothing, only to realize they are everything. Innovation doesn't have an address.